do you have any other thoughts about, from the perspective of having watched this campaign? Tom says it was more of a negative story. Ann says it was more a positive story.
No.
Do you have a sense of what you thought was the? I'm not saying there's a single silver bullet here. I'm just asking, as you watched the campaign, what struck you as one of his more effective lines of argument or message?
Wait, of Obama?
Yeah.
I mean, because I was saying the story I think that was most effective was the one that was untold. I guess of the, not really. I mean, the only actual, I cannot remember a single thing that Obama said during the campaign. I don't remember a minute of his convention speech. The only thing I remember is the Bill Clinton one. Bill Clinton seemed to articulate and define the Democratic message in a way that the president never was able to.
Well, you knew he was pro-choice. You knew that he was supportive of gay rights. You knew, I mean, there was a lot of things that you knew. And so there was a message that came through somewhere. And so you may not remember,
right.
You may not remember the spot that did it, but you knew he was believed in climate change. He wanted to do something about it. So you knew somewhere there was some messaging going on.
You knew he was for the DREAM Act. You know, these were very targeted micro messages.
Yeah. So Megan, you may not remember the spot, but you remember the message.
But we do remember. Not only you mentioned talking about his wife. I would have added his daughters to your story. I think he used his daughters over and over again to say, "I'm a parent." Parent is a nonpartisan word. It's a nonpartisan role. I think he was, and it doesn't relate to party, it doesn't relate to race. It's a message that's universal. And I think a lot of his stories were universal. As a son, as a grandson, as a parent. I agree, Tom, that they were more powerful the first time we met him. But he kept telling them. And they continued to reverberate in part because Romney couldn't match him. Romney could not talk about not being able to pay off his student loans because Romney didn't have any problems paying off his student loans.
Romney could have told so many stories. I'm sorry, no, he can't talk about student loans. But he could have, the one, for example, in the debate where he said, look, I have 5 boys, and they may keep telling you,
and we
giving you
never
the
heard
same
that line
excuse.
Again. It was a great line, and we never heard it again.
But if it wasn't true the first time, it's not true on the 10th time. No, but there are many. When you're talking about health care, you can talk about issues around the kitchen table.
Why didn't he, Ann? I mean, you talk about, let's say, Ann Romney. I thought in the beginning of the campaign, Ann Romney would be a marvelously effective surrogate, that she could talk about some of the intimate and personal stories, particularly of her health struggles. When she talked about that and when he talked about that, he became a much more human and relatable person. Why didn't they do that more?
You know, I think all I can say is that, again, let me say, one of the things I've learned about campaigns is when you win a very tough race, on Monday morning, or Wednesday morning, you're the most brilliant person and run the best race in the whole world. But when you lose a race, there are enough Monday morning quarterbacks.
I understand,
but I do think that there was an insular thing about this campaign. They were people, they were in Boston, they had been lifelong supporters of Mitt Romney. They were the same people that were part of the Circle the Wagon sort of group. And so often I felt like they could have used the advice of new thinking and new thoughts. Because, as I said, I mean, I think of so often, I always talked about being a parent. When people said, you know, the first time I had to run for re-election, it was so tough, and Donna Shalala was talking about midnight basketball, and I said, you know, I sort of think of all the Friday nights when I stand there at midnight and wait for my kids to walk in the door, and I'm sort of thinking, gosh, if Donna Shalala could run a midnight basketball, and I didn't have to do this, would that help? But nothing would replace a parent standing in the kitchen waiting for the kids to come in. Everybody understood that.
I'm going to get to your questions in just a minute. So, do we have microphones?
Microphone over there. Microphone over there. Sum up what you're trying to get to.
So, anybody wants to ask a question, start coming up to the mics. I'll get you in just a minute. Go ahead.
I think Charlie Cook summed it up a long time ago when he said that if President Obama was elected, it would be because, or it would be despite the economy, and if Romney won, it would be despite his campaign. And so that sort of sums it up.
One final question, I'll get to anybody want to say what they thought was Romney's, I mean, he's lost, okay? But what was his most effective argument? I mean, he came close, as you say. Probably, people say, well, he wasn't a very good candidate, but I think most of
his most
he was the
effective-
best of the field.
His most effective argument was the economy.
Yeah.
No question about it. The exit polls show that. But he got off that message on several days. We had some Senate candidates that thought they were doctors, and the message would shift back and
Doctors are
forth.
theologians.
Or both. Well, they combined them. But Steve, so you had some of that, and when they could stay on those issues, they do well. But the Obama team was very good on Bain Capital, putting the class warfare,
Right.
doing these kinds of things that tried to stymie that. I just want to say again, the groups that were the hardest hit by this administration's policies, women, African Americans, young people, where the highest unemployment occurred in this administration were his most loyal groups.
But the same thing is true of Romney. The people who were helped most by this economy, really rich people, were Romney's strongest supporters.
Well,
Part of the problem with Romney's economic message was it wasn't coherent. He said, yeah, the economy's bad. Everybody knew that. The question they had was, are you the guy to solve it? And when push came to shove, he really couldn't answer.
he didn't have the credibility.
He didn't have the math. I mean, as simple as that.
Well, let's
He
let
did
these
not
folks
have the math. Ryan didn't have the math. When the question was, okay, you're going to give us
Well,
these tax cuts, and that's all
nobody's
gonna
got
harm
the
the
math.
math.
That's why we're running $1 trillion deficit.
But
one
he
at a
was
time.
claiming the math. He was claiming that he had the solution. He put out the $5 trillion tax cut, and then he couldn't explain how it held together without taxing the middle class. The middle class is not stupid. They said, wait a minute, how's this going to work? Everybody's asking him. 60 Minutes is asking him, how's this work? They're asking Ryan, how's this going to work? Well, I don't have enough time to explain it. The message was not coherent.
Al,
It didn't hold together.
nobody's got numbers that add up, which
But
is
we
why
weren't
we're running
claiming
$1
it.
trillion.
But we never claimed
yes,
it.
they
You
did.
said
Yes,
that
he
was
did.
his best message.
Yes, he
it was
did.
not his best
No,
message.
the
'cause he
economy
didn't
was
I
want
the
the
think, I
deficit
think we
at the
can
time.
stipulate that no one was telling the truth during the campaign.
No, I'm
a
sorry.
campaign.
I'm not
It's a
stipulating.
campaign.
I'm
He was
not
not
stipulating
coherent
that. I'm
on his
sorry.
message.
On
His message
fiscal
wasn't
matters,
coherent.
No, I'm not
you thought
stipulating
Mitt
that.
Romney was telling the truth on fiscal
I
matters?
believe
The
when
economy
I don't
was
think-
bad. That part was
here's
true.
why Mitt Romney said that. I mean, and they came back and said, I mean, you can cap what people's deductions are at 50,000, at 75,000, and the math works out. The problem is.
But he never stuck to one of them. He said,
The
which
problem
one?
is, yes,
Which-
why
which
do
one and
why
which-
do they want to say which one? Because soon as he
Reasonable
says
question.
Big Bird.
It's a reasonable question.
No, it's because soon as you say Big Bird, they go out and get
Well,
all
let's
the
forget
people
Big
we're
Bird. They
saying,
said,
no.
what
Okay.
You say.
is it the mortgage interest deduction? That's what people want to know. Is it
It's
the charitable
only
deduction?
if
That's what
that's-
people want to know. He could never answer that.
I'm gonna allow.
I'm sorry.
I'm going to allow our friends here in the audience to ask a question.
Stipulating.
Please, go ahead.
I will stipulate this, that we won't need fact checkers for this, when it shows on C-SPAN or the Archives channel, wherever it shows. And the reason I can say that is I just spent a number of months campaigning for Mr. Obama. And what you said is so fascinating, because it really, I was sitting back there saying, I did it. Well, they know how it really worked, and many things did. I just want to share two observations, and I have a question. You talk about the sophistication. It could have gone to either side. I knocked personally probably on more than 1,000 doors. And of those 1,000 doors, I encountered 7 Republicans. That's how sophisticated it can get. And that can go to either
So
side.
you weren't wasting your time, is what you're saying.
That's basically, I don't feel that.
And that's what I was
four
saying,
of them
that he
were
had a
Mormons who lived in my
handheld-
building who were campaigning for Romney. So I mean, we had a wrong number. I mean, that's really what happened. And people, that's another thing, and they were very
Because
nice on both sides.
but you were told where to go by the
Here's
campaign.
how sophisticated that was.
called working
Not only
smart.
were we told where to go, we could receive messages on our cell phone that could change from where we went. In other words, if a script changed, and everything was scripted in terms of, no, this is who you're going to speak to, this is what we think we're going to do. If that message changed, it could be done that quickly. A second thing is, it's not only just about the media. I liked what you said about the messages. It also, one of the things that does concern me in the sense of expansion and exclusion. I'm a 60-year-old retired reporter. My bosses were a 22-year-old from Brown University, okay, who did an outstanding job, a spokesperson for the DC, at my age, but a spokesperson for the J Street and LGBT community in DC, and a 23-year-old from Scotland. I mean, so I mean, this thing, can go back and forth.
So
my question.
ask a question.
Yeah, my question is this, okay? My question is this. We have the media change, okay? And you were talking about that social media. But I just want to know, what would be, you talk about Lincoln, okay, he couldn't handle it today. What would be the ideal social media candidate today, putting it all together, the old, the new, whatever, or is it still back, I mean, you kind of touched on it, is it still just simply message, but can an ugly person with a good message win?
Who wants to answer? Ideal social.
Not as easily.
Well, a lot of it depends on the demographics of the district. I mean, in my old district, a Republican who was a pro-choice Republican was a doctor, had asked a former patient of his who he had impregnated to get a divorce. Pro-life, excuse me, to get an abortion. Well, I mean, some might think that was hypocritical. Yet he won with 60% of the vote. So you got, there's also, you have to put it into a demographic context.
Let me make a comment. This country is very divided. You can look at the maps, you can look, so there isn't an ideal candidate. It's so polarized, I don't know that there's anybody that brings this thing back very, very, very quickly. I think what the president was able to do is to get his demographic excited at a time when there had bad results. 4 years of government, keep them excited, draw the issue lines. And one thing is Republicans, if they didn't know it going in, I think they know it now, is we have a ceiling. Even with a bad economy, there are some groups that are just not ready to come our way. We scare them. And the president was able to mobilize those groups against us as much as for him. And
Albert,
I think they did a very good job.
I think
Okay, over here.
So everybody has been talking about how this was simultaneously an extremely close election and yet a decisive victory for the president. And it seems that up until, well, certainly 2 weeks before the election, a lot of people were talking about the fact that Romney could actually win more than just people on the Romney team. But now we're talking as if it was a fait accompli and that definitively the president had the better system and was definitively going to win because of that system. And there seems to be some contrast between those two perspectives that I was more confident. I was working on the campaign, and I was more confident than a lot of my friends were come the end of Election Day, but a lot of people were stressing this out. And I know people in Chicago were stressing this out, but that doesn't necessarily jive with the entire concept that we're saying, which is, wow, the Obama machine had this down to a science, and therefore we definitely were going to win.
Well, I don't think anybody's saying they were definitely going to win. Among other things, when you got 8% unemployment, you always have to be, be a little nervous on Election Day. But let the panelists go ahead.
On the one hand, all the polls, most of the polls, I won't say all, most of the polls had Obama leading throughout. There was never a sense where Romney's leading in a lot of the polls. That was never the case. So you always have some advantage. So you're going to believe you're going to win if you believe the polls. So I think that was part of it. Then again, he had a ground game, which is where I started this conversation in terms of local officers and ground troops. Tom will tell you he had an advantage in terms of the list, all that was playing. But I still say underneath all of that was, he was talking about the DREAM Act, and he was talking about a reasonable immigration policy that attracted a lot of people. He was talking about reproductive rights that impacted a lot of people. So underlying the technology and the ground game was also some very solid messaging points. Together, I think that's what gave me the advantage.
This was always going to be a 52-48 race, no matter who won it. You look back to the 2000 election, the 2004 elections, about 50-50. Like 2008, you had an unpopular Republican in the White House. You had two wars that hadn't gone according to plan. Republicans were defending. Obama had at least a 2-to-1 spending advantage because he didn't take the federal match. And then Lehman Brothers and Wall Street collapses in September on the Republicans' watch, and he gets 53%. I mean, he topped out this time, 51-52. So it was a question of maximizing what you can get. There were some undecided voters in the economy and the bad results that the president had over 4 years, the bad outcomes, I should say, from his policies, gave him a vulnerability and a window of opportunity to the Republicans. But on our best day, we weren't going to be better than 52-48. And on the president's best day, he wasn't going to be there. So this was run basically inside the 45-yard lines. And the social media and these issues, I think, did make a huge difference in able to mobilize and energize a voter base that had been, frankly, the victims of some of these bad results. Part of that was demonizing art, and part of it was going back to the dream and you're invested in me and stay with me. And they did it's a 50-48 race. So this is a very close race that could have gone either way, and the election day wasn't that decisive. I mean, John Boehner also thinks he has a mandate. Harry Reid thinks he has a mandate. The president thinks he has a mandate. We're back to the same players that kicked the can down the road in the last Congress. So,
well, and I just point out that 2 weeks before the election, it isn't true that all the polls showed that the president was ahead. In fact, the Real Clear Politics average had Romney up a point. He was ahead in Virginia. He was ahead in Florida, if you believe the polls. He was ahead in Colorado. That would have looked a lot different on Election Day had that happened. Then Sandy came. I'd say the third debate took the wind out of the sails. Sandy came. That again took all the energy. I mean, the entire focus of the country was on Sandy, took all the energy out of the campaign. So I wouldn't agree with you that it always was clear that the president was going to win. It wasn't always clear.
I think Sandy had a very interesting impact right at the end. The cliche is he looked presidential, but it was more than that.
Yes.
You notice that Barack Obama did not take that blue jacket off from the day he walked the beaches of New Jersey with Chris Christie to the end of the campaign. He wanted everybody to remember that moment. He wanted, because it was a nonpartisan moment. Mm-hmm. It was a moment of practicality. It's one of the great gifts of God that the hurricane hit on a state that had a Republican governor.
He was, as a matter of fact, he had demonized. I mean, one of the reasons there's so many hurt feelings here is that this president, unlike the previous president, beat up on Republicans, by name Republicans, every single day of 4 years. And he came back that week before the election with a Republican that basically said, this is the best friend I have ever had. I've needed him. He's been there every minute. And it took away one of Mitt Romney's biggest arguments about why he should be
Steve,
president.
in addition to that, it just froze the campaign for several days,
that's what
which a challenger needs when
Yeah.
you're getting traction at the end.
I'd be interested in your reactions to what I thought was one of the stories that the Republicans tried to tell about Obama, that he was somehow the foreigner, the guy from Europe. It's all those commercials seem to me to be right out of the 50s. I have a very conservative brother who fought Spartacus being shown in Syracuse, and it's things that I've heard from him for all these years. And I spent half an hour trying to explain Eastern European history to a young lady just a week ago at a bar, and she doesn't, and Obama supporters, it did not resonate with them at all.
Did I just quote you accurately? Said, I tried to explain Eastern European history to a young lady in a bar?
I'm thinking
Did it
it
work?
That sounds like 3 in the
That was
morning.
not a very good
conversations.
pickup line.
Is that the best
If you're Bill
pickup line you
Clinton.
could
I'm
think
thinking
of?
in
You went home
particular
empty-handed.
of that commercial where the Hungarian guy talks about Obama as the other, the foreigner. And
It's a very good question.
and I
See,
just,
there are two,
and they
they're
don't
just
understand.
conflicting worldviews. There are just conflicting worldviews. This country is very divided, and that's one narrative, and frankly, to a young lady at a bar late at night, you're probably not going to convince her.
Well,
Well, let me just say
But
that there was
deal with this
there-
question. Why didn't
Okay.
that argument work?
No, because it's held by such a small group. It's sort of like when George Bush was the president, and you had people that said Bush lied, and they believed that in fact they had planned the 9/11 attack, that they had actually instigated it, and so forth. But I'm sure that the Democrats in this room, you would laugh at that and say nobody really thinks that. Well, nor do the thinking Republicans. I do think that was tied around the necks of Republicans as being more mainstream thought. Then most of us look at Democrats and think that most of them think that we attacked ourselves on 9/11. So but I would just say, their campaigns have a way of attracting a few crazy people. And I would just ask anybody that's ever run for office if they ever had one race where there weren't a few crazy people that walked in the door and wanted to help.
But
or
when
give their
18%
opinion.
of Americans don't think Obama's a Christian, that's not a fringe group. That is 1 out of 5 Americans. That is not an argument that is just made by a few kooks.
That is the triumph of the internet, which has no filters.
Well,
Go ahead.
this is an interesting subject we haven't touched on, which is I do think that when the Republican Party goes through a bit of self-examination after this election, they're going to realize 2 things that hurt them. One is that that primary campaign was energetic, but having people who were as kooky as some of the folks who were running up there on stage with the person who would end up being their nominee did not make that party look didn't make it look mainstream. When you have people who are as odd as Michelle Bachmann can be, and as Herman Cain can be, and as Rick Perry apparently can be, it didn't make the party look good. And I also think that the conservative media has been so effective at helping the growth of conservative movement and helping the Republican Party over the past 30 years, but I don't think it helped in the 2008 election. I do think that the way...
The 2012, you mean?
2012, excuse
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
The way it became its kind of own insular bubble, the way there was so much time spent on these non-controversies and stupid controversies and paranoid theories about Obama, and that was the sort of subject of discussion of a lot of conservative media a lot of the time, was not time well spent or
See,
energy well spent.
I would take a little bit of issue and say, I agree with your point, but part of the reason they weren't is because some of them were after Romney up until like the very end of the campaign. Laura Ingraham and Bill Kristol and some of them. I mean, he never was enough for them. And when I'd hear him, I'd think, well, if those are our friends, man, who needs enemies? And it's very annoying. It's very annoying.
One quick point on it can work either way. When you've got people out on fringes you're running against, sometimes if you slap them down, you look more credible to others. But I think what really hurt was the immigration issue. And the fact that when you had Governor Perry and you had Gingrich kind of being pro-immigrant and Romney went after him on that issue, it hurt his credibility later in trying to go after those
It was
groups.
in my view, it was the single biggest mistake Mitt Romney made in the entire campaign, was going to the right on immigration. Single biggest mistake he made. Go ahead.
Thank you for the conversation. Looking ahead, knowing tomorrow President Obama is going to be speaking in the afternoon about the economy, and thinking about what is coming in front of us with lame duck, do you think that President Obama is going to use social media tactics, the way that he's been connecting with people, when he has to turn the conversation more to potentially about sacrifice or what's kind of coming down the road? How does he do that in a way that he's been connecting with people already on their everyday lives?
Interesting question.
Yeah.
Who's got an answer? David, what do you think?
I think he's been worse using that stuff to govern than he has been to campaign. I think he's really good at it and the campaigning end of it. I can't think of, when you think of healthcare, for example, that was a chance he had to mobilize the nation and to mobilize his supporters, and he did a pretty poor job of it. So I'm not sure that he's going to be able to do that outside of the context of the campaign.
Well, he's already said he's going to try to do it. I mean, he's already made that clear. Now, whether he can do it successfully is another matter. I would think that he'll do it more successfully than in the past, partly because things are still hot and they know what they're doing. But he's already said he's going to go outside of Washington to try to move these kind of issues.
He has been singularly unsuccessful in doing that in his first term. He was able to accomplish some of this with a Democratic Congress, but remember, the vast majority of these Republicans are in pretty safe districts. They worry about their primary elections. They're not worried about general election voters, and this is not going to work with them. In fact, it could have an effect of backfiring and making it harder for the Speaker to deliver votes when his caucus digs in on these issues. So I think it's a double-edged sword.
Is what he's going to be for. What is he going to, if he's going to compromise, is he going to draw a line in the sand where he isn't going to compromise, or what's he going to do on social media? I mean, in the end, usually you get down to the last hour before everybody gives more than they wanted to, but finally finds a middle ground.
Yeah, absolutely. But you're talking about both a framework and then the details within the framework. I agree that he has not been nearly as effective using social media as a legislative tool as he has been as a political tool. Go ahead.
And I don't think social media is as good a vehicle for legislative work as it is for campaign work.
Why, Al? That's an interesting point.
Micro-targeting works really well when you want to isolate narrow slices and give them targeted messages. But you're really talking about mobilizing fairly substantial groups of people who are, let's say, soft, because you're right about the hard partisans. They're not going to be moved by anything he says. But there's a soft group in there, independents and soft folks, that if you do it in the State of the Union, it's a much more effective tool. I believe one of Obama's mistakes was he didn't do enough in the State of the Union in terms of the deficit, which opened the door for a lot of this other conversation. But I think, and I had a conversation earlier today with some of the Democratic leadership, the action is going to come over from the Senate with having been blessed by Obama. That's where the deal's going to be. And then it's going to be put to the House. And then Obama's going to try to use, I think, more traditional media, speaking to the mass of America, to sell this by saying, we got it out of the Senate, this is a good deal, it's a compromise, and this is why
And to add to your point, one of the things about social media, it's particularly effective in a campaign, not only for micro-targeting, but you have one question, who are you going to vote for, and you have a specific date on which you have to force people to make a decision. A legislative fight is so much more diffuse and so much more amorphous that it's much harder to focus people's. That gentleman who talked about knocking on 1,000 doors, he was aimed at one thing, which is getting people to vote on one day. It's a much clearer target, and I think you can use the media much that way. Go ahead.
Well, just to tie in with the gentleman and what you just said, I worked very enthusiastically for the campaign. I live in Mitchellville, and I would drive to Richmond in Northern Virginia to knock on doors because I felt a real connection. Now, Obama's campaign didn't have a monopoly on that tactic of getting young people to come in and work very hard. And one of the things they told us in the sessions, the training, was tell your story. So I'd knock on doors and I would tell my story and engage the prospective voter. Why wouldn't Romney's campaign not do the same thing? Tell his story. He has a lovely family. He could have articulated all of that and brought more people in. Why do you think he didn't do that?
I think he was a very private person. I think everything from his religious background and commitment, that you don't tout what you do, that you know, sort of like it jives with sort of the Catholic background. If you seek applause here on this earth for what you do, you know you forego the afterlife sort of benefit. I mean, that's simplistic, and I hate to ruin theology that much, but yeah, I hope my pastor isn't watching me. But my point is that I think he's a very private person, and I think religiously he is a very private person. What sort of ministry he's done, what sort of contributions he's made, what sort of life commitments he's made, those are all things that are very private. And the people that know him well, and in the end, he started unraveling some of those things. But wearing his life on his sleeve was something that is just simply not part of who he is.
Just to add to that, Ann, I think it's interesting. I think they made a big error, and maybe it's just because of the nature of who Romney is, but I think they thought that his Mormonness would appear too other to some people, and I think that was a huge mistake. I mean, I think he should have been out there. The more I learned about that,
the more I did too.
I thought, wow, what a life of service.
Yeah.
And they didn't tell it at all.
You wonder why such a private person is running for president in the first place. I mean, you knew that this was going to be,
he was running because he felt like he could change this country's direction, and that was important.
But wouldn't he have to understand that telling those stories is part of being a candidate in modern America?
Do you know how many candidates you meet who just can't bring themselves to pick up the phone and ask for money? I mean, you're like, why did you run? How many, Tom?
I know.
More than you can
We
count.
pick up the phone
for him. So there are things some candidates aren't good at.
Tom, why do you think he wasn't better at telling these stories?
Well, frankly, I think we felt that we wanted somebody who could turn the country around, not somebody you want to go to a ball game with. That in point, this is a guy who had turned around everything he had touched. and been successful in everything he'd done
But
in life.
wasn't this notion of, oh, go to a ball game
guess
or
that
have a
doesn't
beer
count.
with, that was an oversimplification of what we're talking about. Because it's a much, it's a deeper idea of, does he share my values? Does he understand my life? This is not just
No.
having a beer with somebody.
No.
It's likability. And the American people almost always vote for the most likable person.
Well, yeah,
and
even-
I sat at dinner
Too
with,
bad.
with John Kerry 2 years before he ran, and I knew he wasn't going to win.
Enough said.
It's always like
The old windsurfer.
there you go.
If you want to psychoanalyze it, I mean, there'll probably be some disagreement here. But when Governor Romney was governor, he was a fairly liberal governor. He was for, a leader in trying to deal with climate change in a variety of different areas. I think you have a person that was much like George Bush the first, very decent, very bright, raised in a privileged environment, and with that privilege, he was somewhat isolated, and his parents told him, you have this privilege, and because of that, you have a responsibility. So I don't think, Bill Clinton could tell you 137 things that he wanted to do as president. George Bush couldn't tell you probably 2. I'm not sure that the first. I don't think that Governor Romney could, because they wanted to be president to make good decisions. Because of their class, that's what they were supposed to do. They were raised to do that. They were given special situations, to do that. And so he wanted to come in and organize the government to work well. And when a situation came before him, to make a good decision about that. But he didn't come in with really a moral compass on what he wanted to get done. So it was hard to tell the story because the story kept changing.
I just have to say I completely disagree with that.
Okay,
I just
that's
can't
fine.
let that just go. I think that he's a private person. I think
So
there
is he
were
for
differences.
climate change or
No,
against
no,
climate
no.
change?
Let her finish.
Let me
Let her
say,
finish.
when he was in Massachusetts, I think that it was an entirely different time. The public's view of things, I mean, when I first got to Congress, we were warned, all of us, that there was going to be a terrorist attack. It's not if it's going to come, it's when it's going to come. But did we stop everything and deal with terrorist attacks all the time? No, but we did starting in 2002 and from September 11th on. Well, by the same token, I think the things first of all, you learn something when you're the governor. You learn what works and you learn what doesn't work. And I think that he went through healthcare reform. First of all, he put a much more conservative healthcare reform on the table, and I believe he vetoed the first bill they sent up to him because he thought it was too expensive. The second one, they cut it back and he signed it. So I'm just saying, people evolve. They
determined they want to be president, and so that the politics of the nation might be different than the politics of Massachusetts?
Well, Steve, people have to be who they are. Not everybody's going to be a Hail Fellow where Nixon wasn't a Hail Fellow. Well, I mean, people get elected all the time that aren't extroverts. And that's just not who he was. And you don't want to the worst thing in politics is try to be something you're not.
And Obama's not
Let me get one more question in before we have to go. Go ahead, please.
On the issue.
So I want to thank Congressman Nguyen, who gave me my takeaway from tonight, the difference between social media and all this data mining, the difference between campaigning and legislating. So that was very helpful to me. I also just wanted to say one thing about the demonization of people, that Romney was demonized by the ads, but Obama's been demonized for 4 years so that people think he's a Kenyan. I just put that out there. But my question is really about the old and the new. Karl Rove was doing the old way of raising a lot of money and doing a money avalanche. There's a really interesting article in Time magazine in the Swampland blog that I recommend to all of you that talks about the real sophisticated data mining that the Obama campaign used in the Chicago office, and a couple of the people who worked on the campaigns have mentioned it. So it's somewhat about demographics, but you knew which door to knock on. So my question really is this, comparing the old and the new, the difference between an avalanche of money versus data mining, the difference between the changing demographics. What is the Republican Party going to do between now and the next election to really try to examine why it was not appealing to more people, to a more diverse group of voters. When Bill O'Reilly says traditional Americans, he's not including people like me. But we are traditional Americans. So what is the Republican Party going to do? I know.
Okay, let me-
that's the question.
Okay,
First of all, let me just say, this was a 50-48 race. This isn't Goldwater, where we had a third
Right.
of the
No,
Senate
like-
and carried
right.
6 states. So it's a closely divided country. But look, I think Republicans have to do outreach to some groups that are very gettable for us. We have to add pieces to our coalition, and hopefully we can talk to you and bring you aboard.
You used to be my congressman.
yeah.
You are a congressman I would vote for.
Well, keep talking. That was,
There were, I would say,
There aren't
I
many
would
like
say there are
him.
two. I would say there are two areas where I think that the message, and I also, I mean, if you start changing, like, okay, well, we're really not going to worry about balancing the budget. We're really not going to worry about the deficit. We're not going to think a strong national defense. I mean, for every vote we pick up, we'll lose a vote, so, but I think that there were a couple of things in theme that were missing. One was that I think Romney suffered from the idea that the choice was to continue with what Barack Obama is doing or go back to George Bush. I think Romney had to better articulate why what he was proposing was not what George Bush did for 8 years. And he never made that distinction, I don't think, clear enough. And so he was vulnerable there. I think the other thing that the Republican Party always fails to do when it comes to build a stronger coalition is to say what we believe is good for this country. Growth is good for every American, for Americans that feel like discouraged, for Americans that are wondering if it's possible for them to be self-sufficient. Not just good for middle class and upper middle class Americans. If we don't think what we stand for, a growing economy, a vibrant economy, an economy that isn't burdened with debt and regulations, if we don't think it's good for a third of the economy, then it's not a good plan. It has to be good for everybody, and we don't articulate that.
Tom, you always stood for realism as a political figure, and Mike Murphy has said the coming fight in the Republican Party is between the mathematicians and the priests, between the people who can actually count, which was something you always stood for, and those who approach politics as theology. How do the mathematicians like yourself convince the priests that, to follow up on your question, that to be a modern party, you have to be able to count?
Yeah, do you want to be a political party, a welcoming party, out attracting converts, or do you want to be like a church that's chasing out heretics? Do you want to be a private club where you have to pass an admissions test to get in and have a litmus test, or do you want to be a party that's welcoming and recognized? If you look at the Democratic Party, at this point, it's a lot of diverse groups together that are targeted over certain issues, in some cases just because we've alienated them. We have a huge problem with the fastest growing parts of the population, Hispanics and young people. If we don't solve that problem, the math just isn't there over the long term. Even when you can't win in a bad economy with 8% unemployment, it says something about the ceiling we put on ourselves. We've got to have to change that. Look, there are a lot of pro-life Hispanics. There are a lot of free economy young people that share a lot of principles
Hispanic
with the
business
Republican
people.
Party.
I mean,
absolutely. But we're putting up other barriers so that they're not coming in. I think that whole attitude has to change at this point.
Final word, Bart.
Well, Al and I have gone through this on the Democratic side. In terms of, I'll tell you what's going to be happening. They're going to go in, and the extremes of each party, the more, our liberals or their conservatives, the extremes of the party are going to say the reason we didn't win, we didn't go to the base enough. We didn't tell the real story.
Not pure enough.
The moderates are going to say we didn't win because you got to get in the middle. And there are more extremes than there are moderates in both parties. And so this was not a thrashing, as Tom said. This was not Goldwater. And so the epiphany hadn't come yet. So what's going to wind up happening? They're going to go through this. And the same thing with the Democrats. The Democrats are going to say, well, why in the hell didn't we not win the House? Obama won. And they're going, well, we weren't liberal enough. No, we didn't get enough to the center. So they're both going to do it. But this is not an epiphany. So what's going to happen is Republicans are going to come out with much of the same thing, saying it a little bit nicer, until they get whooped and then like we've been whooped, and then they'll make some changes. They'll probably win things, and then we'll have to have the same conversation in a few years.
We didn't win in 2010. It was a vote basically it was a vote against the Democrats. They weren't electing us. They just fired us in 2006 and in 2008. But look, we have to be an open party. We've got to be a welcoming party if we want to continue to win elections. And as Bart said, we're going to go through this internecine fight at this point over what the right thing is, right or left. It's basically, we have a group, there's not enough senior white guys to go around and add to your coalition. We've about maxed ourselves out there. We've got to be looking somewhere else.
I think the most important figure that I saw in any poll on election night was 34. You know what that was? The number of white men who voted in the last election. You've been a great audience. We appreciate the McGowan Foundation and their support. We appreciate the National Archives. And we appreciate you as an audience that shared your evening with us, so thanks very much. And thanks to my panel as well.